Hello, students. Let's talk a little bit more about colonial New England. So, colonial New England and New England includes this kind of area of the United States. So, this is Maine, modern day Maine, New Hampshire, Virginia, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut down here. So Plymouth, which is right here, it eventually becomes part of Massachusetts Colony. Massachusetts Colony is this one right here. Massachusetts Colony is founded in 1630, and Massachusetts also claims what's now Maine. Rhode Island Colony becomes a colony in 1636, Connecticut in 1636 as well, and New Hampshire in 1638. And at this time in colonial times, what today is Vermont is being kind of contested between New Hampshire and New York. So one big idea I wanted to introduce you to is the idea of the New England village. So when the Pilgrims and the Puritans and other New England settlers came, they lived in villages. So they would all live close together, and in the middle of their village, they would have some green space. It's called the village green. Today, many of these greens have been turned into parks. They would have a big church, they would have a town hall, and they would have a school that would be right here in the center of their community. And they would meet together in their community a lot. Because their homes are so close, they are living kind of in each other's pockets and they're very aware of what's going on in everybody else's life. And we kind of saw this when we talked about the Salem witch trials, how they are very aware of what's going on in everybody else's houses, and that's because they're living in these villages. So this is a map of a village, and you can see here this village green, the church, the town hall, and the school, and then the homes are kind of around this village green. Then outside of the village green, we can see these farms. So you would live in a house like here, and then you would walk out to your farm to work your farm every day. We have our mill here, which is where they would grind their wheat into flour. This is a river, and they have some common ground. So what I want you to notice as well is that they have cow pasture and woods out here. So this is going to cause some conflict with Native Americans because the New England settlers didn't recognize the native farms as farms because New Englanders were expecting farms to be like this with rows and fenced off. They didn't realize, or they didn't want to realize, that the areas where the Native Americans were growing their squash and their beans and their corn were actually farms. And so the New Englanders would just let their cows kind of wander in the woods, and the cows would eat all of the Native American crops. So that caused conflict between the New Englanders and the Native Americans in the area. The New Englanders as well would have lots and lots of kids, and so when you had a kid, then your child would build another house and they would get some more farmland, and eventually the farms would be too far from the village to make it worth walking to the village. So then they would start a new village out where their farms were. And so that's how these colonies grew, is you would start in a village and then you would start a new village and they would just sort of grow that way. So this is example notes from the first half when we were watching the Khan Academy video. Remember, please, 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 please don't erase what you have. Just add so that you are and can make sure you have complete information. If you already have stuff there, leave it there. This is kind of what I was thinking. Don't write down exactly what I was thinking because you don't have my brain. So why did Puritans come to the New World? They wanted to practice their religion the way they wanted to. They wanted to create a perfect society. Remember, we call them Puritans because they wanted to purify. And they want to create England 2.0. Like it's going to be England, but better. And eventually, everyone from England will be like, oh man, we should really live like the Puritans are in New England. And they would invite the people in New England back. So because of that, the Puritans are not interested in mixing with Native Americans at all. They want to keep very separate, and they want to create another England here in the New World. And that's going to extend to everything from the way they build their homes. They're going to build very traditional English homes just with materials they could find here, and the way they set up their villages. Again, those village greens, their cows on the outside, their farms. They're going to try to set up another England here. It's funny, side note, because this is extended in England. If you cut down the trees, what kind of just grows on the ground is grass, like green lawn grass. And Americans today have green lawn grass because we're still, in some ways, trying to be England 2.0. So it's kind of a funny holdover from these Puritans. In New England, their climate and environment, they have rocky soil, they have lots and lots of trees, and it is cold. So they have nice warm summers, but they have cold, cold winters. What type of industry were people in New England participating in? They had small farms. They participated in fishing and fur trapping. Mostly they would trade with Native Americans for these furs rather than catch them themselves. And they were artisans. They were making stuff. So this is stuff like shoes and barrels and buckets and all the things that they need. Um, People who came to New England were mostly middle class. They were skilled workers, so that meant that they could read. And they usually have like a special skill. That's why we call them artisans. And maybe that was making shoes or carving things, or maybe they were blacksmiths, or maybe they were bankers, or they were lawyers. So they had these skills. And they came in families. So because of that, they had more even numbers of men and women. The other great thing about New England, unlike the southern colonies that we'll talk about later, is that it's actually a very nice area to live. So you can live up to be 70 years old, which was remarkable at the time. Their society, because they came in families and were mostly middle class, it was pretty equal. The church and the state were basically the same, though. So we saw this again in the Salem witch trials, how like you were accused of witchcraft, which is a crime in the church, and so they take you to the town hall and they try you with their actual judges and give you actual punishments like being hung. And they were very, very strict. So no Christmas, no holidays, no public drinking. It was very, very strict lifestyle. So there are three big conflicts I wanted to talk about. And the first one we're going to talk about is religious conflict. So in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which they got there in 1630, remember, by 1636, so they've only been there for about 6 years, they're starting to have some major problems. And I wanted to talk about two of the kind of problem makers, the rabble rousers. So this first one right here, this is Anne Hutchinson, and she wanted to be able to preach. She said, I can read the Bible and I have just as good as thoughts as the men. And so she had like little Bible groups and she would teach, and she was very outspoken in her beliefs. She would speak out against the preachers. And the ruling men in the Massachusetts colony did not like this. They did not approve. Along with Anne Hutchinson, there were some other people, like this is Roger Williams here, who also had very different ideas about the way they should be living and the things they should be doing. And they were very outspoken. They were willing to talk about this. So what happened is that both of them were exiled. Roger Williams goes to what is now Rhode Island, and he purchases the land from the Native Americans there, which is one of the big things he believed, is that they should be purchasing the land from the Native Americans. Anne Hutchinson joins him in Rhode Island for a while. She takes her family there, but eventually she's worried about getting killed because the men in the Massachusetts Bay Colony really, really didn't like her. So she ends up moving to what is now New Amsterdam, and her family is actually killed in a fight there in New Amsterdam. But so that's Anne Hutchinson. This is Roger Williams. They had conflict with the kind of main people in the colony, and the result was that they were exiled, and so they started new colonies. And this is how both the colonies of Connecticut and New Hampshire were started as well, that there were some people who didn't agree with what was going on, so they went out and started new colonies. There were also conflicts with the Native Americans, and I wanted to talk about two specific colonial conflicts. The first one I wanted to talk about is the Pequot War. So in the Pequot War, the Pequots were a group of Native Americans who lived in now what is today Connecticut, and they were enemies to sort of the local the rest of the tribes. So there was some conflict there. Um, but there was also conflict between the Dutch and the French and the English over who would be trading furs. And the Pequots got kind of caught in the middle of this international fight about who would be trading furs. And then a war started. And so what happened is that the English and their Native American allies ended up winning. This is a um, a map of the battle that took place, and you can see you've got the English here and then their Native American allies here. And they surrounded the village and burned it to the ground and killed all of the Pequots they could find. The Pequots who survived this and other massacres were shipped off as slaves to the West Indies or were forced to join other tribes, and they were told that they could never be Pequots again. So they kind of lost their whole identity as a people. The second one I wanted to talk about was the